Hi, I'm Ken Crawford, president of the Alaska Conference, and I want to show you around my Alaska. I love it here.
This is not the end of the world, but it's pretty close. I love Alaska. It's the greatest adventure you could ever imagine. If you want to find out more, go to our website, alaskaconference.org, and you'll find all kinds of information and stories on what Alaska is like.
There's a constant collision between civilization and nature because we live next to each other. There's a feeling of remoteness, not isolation, but remoteness. There is a vastness in the wilderness in Alaska. The mountains are more majestic. Nature is undisputed master. There's something about this country that sets off in me a craving for heaven.
Just an hour north of Anchorage lies the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, an area known today for being the fastest growing region in Alaska. But back in 1935, as part of the New Deal, the valley's modern history began with only 202 families. Struggling from the Depression, these families were offered a chance at a better life by starting a new farming colony.
My folks lived in Moose Lake, Minnesota. They were destined to go to Florida, and then all of a sudden things changed. My father came home and told my mom a week later that they're going to Alaska. She was aghast, you know, she didn't even know where Alaska was hardly. My mom was kind of an adventuresome person, so she was ready to go. Everybody got on the Alaska Railroad and came to Palmer. This was a program that was set up by President Roosevelt at that time, actually. And so the offer that they made was to ship all of us up here. They'd give us $3,000 and 40 acres of land that you could start farming on. But there were 200 families with the colony project. Every family had a tent, and so there were 202 tents that had to be built, and they were right along the railroad track in Palmer. This is me right there. My dad is holding me, and you don't see my face, but that's me. I was just a little squirt. One of the most notable ones it's the picture of drawing for the lot that the 40-acre lot that you're going to have. I am still living on the original land that my dad got in 1935. It was a real scramble to get homes constructed for the coming winter. A lot of them weren't finished inside, and when the winter comes, it comes, and if you aren't ready, you aren't ready. This was a picture of our farm after the buildings were built. We had what they called the colony barn. We had cows and chickens and pigs and turkeys and rabbits, and of course there wasn't any when we first came, there wasn't any electricity, so it was the outhouse, and it was cold in the wintertime and warm in the summer. It's been a very, very good place to raise a family, and our kids grew up on the Butte. It was an exciting time, really.
But as great as the promise of Alaska was, its extreme environment meant tragedy was always close.
This is a photo of my whole family. This was one of the 2 times that our family was together. This is me, but this is my brother Dale, sister Jean May, brother Dale, brother Peter and Jim, and Lynn, and my youngest brother Mark. I lost 3 brothers in airplane crashes, and we fly a lot, you know. If you go to Bristol Bay, you fly. If you go to those things were hard on the family, you know, but you go on anyway.
In the 77 years that passed since the colonists first arrived in Alaska, the valley has changed much. Now a suburb of Anchorage, the population has grown to almost 100,000 people, with a 50% increase in the last decade alone.
It changed from a tent city at one time to virtually, it's got stores here, Fred Meyer's, Safeway, McDonald's, Subway, these stores that people recognize, of course, they're here. And over at Wasilla, they have Home Depot and Target and stores like that. We had everything we needed virtually. Was this colonization a success? Absolutely, it was a success. As far as I'm concerned, it's a real good life, and I couldn't ask for it to be much better.
I'm Dennis Barron, better known as Scotty on the Yukon River. I was mayor of Ruby for a spell back in the 60s, and I didn't run for it. I was elected while I was on a job. But to get the story started, I don't hold a grudge against anybody. It's the story of my forgiveness. I was working for the BLM, loading planes up with JP4 for the firefighters, and somebody pulled the wedge out from the barrels, and 6 barrels came down my leg and crushed it. It split the calf open like a balloon. It just, and all the planes were out on missions, firefighting, so they had to ship a plane in with a Borade bomber to pick me up and haul me into Fairbanks. What they told me is that next winter, is I'd have to stay next to a hospital. And I didn't want to be in Fairbanks, so at that time they had a hospital in Tanana on the Yukon River, where the Tanana River comes into the Yukon. And I decided that I would live in Tanana at the time, that winter, because I knew most everybody there. And so I moved into Tanana. I know with injuries, as long as you keep moving, you can overcome. And I happened to be in one of the stores in Tanana at the time, and a pilot that owned the store approached me and said he'd saw a bunch of number of beaver houses up in the Redland area, and he wanted me to go fly out there and trap them. At that time, I told him I'd go up there and check them, because with beaver, you never know if the house is alive or dead. And so he agreed, and I told him to furnish me with 2 weeks of rations, and that after checking them, I'd be on foot all this time. After checking them, he was to fly back out, and I could tell him if the houses were alive, and at that time bring me some more groceries. And if they were dead, I'd just fly back with him. So he agreed, and so we flew out, and that's the month of March, back in the 60s. And I took a tent, one of the white wall tents, and a sleeping bag, and dry fish, and Sailor Boy crackers, and a lot of tea, and some sugar, and things you normally take on a hunch like this. You don't want to travel too heavy. And I took a dog with me, a Labrador. And I figured, well, I'd tie the Labrador to a toboggan, and he could pull the traps and whatever I needed around to the beaver houses. So he flew me out. We landed on a lake. We were on skis, and he dropped me off. And I pitched the tent up on the side of the lake, got set up, put a wood stove in, a lot of pole wood around. What pole wood is small spruce trees that it's been burned over country, I could tell that. So the spruce trees were all dead and dry. And that's what a big burn does, it killed a tree. So I got all set up for camping and made some tea and had lunch, and figured the next day I'd start walking in one direction. I figured I'd walk in 4 different directions on different days. And so I walked one way the next day, and I put in about 10 miles, and I checked beaver houses. And what you do for checking a beaver house is you dig the feed pile out, and you see if it has live branches or whatever they're eating in it. If they're eating birch, which there weren't any birch, then you'd see birch, but mostly it was willows that was there. So I figured there should be willows. But on every house I dug out, it was a dead house. There wasn't a feed pile. So I knew pretty well had it figured out by the time I figured that, walked that first day, that I was going to be hard put for finding any beaver. That night, when I got back into camp, I cooked up some stuff and some rice and had some dried fish and some crackers and some tea, and made my plans for the next day and walking a different direction. Like the guy said, there were a lot of beaver houses, so I walked in a different direction that next morning, and I checked a lot of houses. Each one of those were dead. And that night, walked back into camp and went through the same procedure of getting ready for the next day. So after 2 weeks, I had it figured out that it wouldn't be worthwhile even staying out there because everything was dead. The country had been burned over, and it takes probably 15, 20 years for anything to move back in because it takes that long for the willows to start coming back. So at 2 weeks' time, I took down camp. I figured he was coming in, and it had snowed, so I walked in the runaway with snowshoes, packed it, and then marked it with spruce trees, cut spruce trees down, young spruce trees that were probably 3 feet high, and I marked the sides and the end of the runaway with it. And got all ready, and the next morning I took my camp down, put everything, packed everything, got ready. I waited all day, and he didn't show up. So I put the tent back up and got ready to spend another night. Well, after taking this tent down for about a week and packing it, I got tired of waiting. So finally at last I decided my rations were all gone. I hadn't had anything to eat for a week. And I figured, well, I'd try to walk out. So I started walking. It was kind of warm, and it started to drizzle. You're up in the mountains like this and walking through ravines. The snow's pretty deep. And with it drizzling the way it was, I was sinking pretty deep in the snow. And the snowshoes that I had the old Babish type webbing, rawhide, and they hadn't been taken care of too well because you have to paint those with a varnish or something to keep the Babish from getting wet. So I walked for about 12 hours in this condition, and the webbing started breaking apart in the snowshoe. And as the webbing started breaking apart, pretty soon the snowshoes weren't worth anything. They weren't holding me up. So I stopped and figured, well, I'll try to build a fire. My matches were all wet, everything. I couldn't get nothing lighted. So I got thinking I'd just stand the snowshoes in the snow there and start walking my trail back to camp. I'd walk for another 12 hours just trying to get back to camp. And during this spell, I was getting pretty tired. You're a week from not eating, so every once in a while I'd sit down and lean myself against a small spruce and try to get recuperated. Well, naturally I'd fall asleep. And I'd wake up with this dog grabbing hold of me and growling and pulling on me, trying to get me to my feet. And this happened 3 times. And he finally got me back to camp after 12 hours of wading in snow that was sometimes up to my crotch. So once I got back to camp, I never built fire or anything. I was pretty wore out. 24 hours of walking will do that without not eating. And so I just crawled in my sleeping bag. And you know, you get hunger pangs to where your stomach's hurting. So what I did, I pulled my boots, bunny boots, inside the sleeping bag with me, and I'd sleep on my stomach on top of them, and it'd keep my stomach from hurting. So this is the way I started enduring each night and day. I'd wake up, make some more tea. I had plenty of tea, no groceries. And then I'd let the tea bags freeze and I'd suck on them. And I don't know if I get any nourishment out of it, but it kind of kept me, you know, moisture going into my system. So during this time, I did a lot of praying. And I'd been raised in the Seventh-day Adventist Church and had been kind of fallen back from the church. But you tend to think about times like this, about God, and you think about Him more and asking Him to forgive you for, you know, your sins, and kind of falling along the wayside. And so this next couple of weeks, I did a lot of praying. It was my wilderness experience. I got back in touch with the Lord and started talking to Him more than I'd ever talked. And on the 40th day, I'd been out there for 40 days now, and I'd gone down miserably. I was getting weak. My arms were getting, I could put my fingers around my arms, and normally I couldn't do that. And on the 40th day, I finally heard a plane. He had finally come back to pick me up, and I was kind of not in my right mind. I put a shell in the chamber, and I was going to shoot him when he got there. Even with the praying I'd been doing, it just, you know, there was a tendency to revenge. So he landed, and he was walking up to me. I had the gun trained on him, and I finally dropped it. And he didn't say a word. He helped me pack my gear, and we loaded it on the plane and loaded the dog up. I might mention during that 2 weeks, I would sight in on my dog every morning and think about eating him. But he was having as rough a time as I was. And so I kind of, I couldn't do it. So we survived the hard times together. Well, we got back to town. The guy didn't say much to me. All he could say, well, I thought you were doing okay. I got back to town, and my neighbor was a nurse. And she invited us over, and she told me, she says, they weighed me, and I went from 205 down to 145 pounds. I was close to starvation. And she told me, she broke out some crackers and cheese, and she said, I don't want you to eat very much. She said, you're going to get awful sick. I think I ate one cracker and a piece of cheese, and I started getting sick. After that, I just got sicker and sicker. It felt like I had to go bathroom, but every time I did, I just had raw acid. It seemed like coming out. I was just hurting bad. I'd try to lay down and it would be worse. I couldn't lay down. So I kept walking. And it was getting dark in Tanana during that spell, and I was walking that night down one of the streets, and I came in under a light. Now, Tanana is a dry town. Most of the old-timers there make homebrews. And I met a couple of guys, a couple of native boys, and they had a sled with a barrel of homebrew on it and some wine bottles filled with homebrew, and they had been drinking it, so they were pretty well lit. When they saw me, I had a beard, and my hair was fairly long, and I looked pretty rugged with the loss of weight. And they mistook me for the pictures of Jesus that they'd seen. And one of them fell down, and the other ran into Toddy Nazevnikoff's house and told him they'd just seen the Lord, and he was swearing off drinking. It took me quite a while to restore my health and get built back up. And during this time, the guy that owned the trap line that I had been flown to, his name was Big Man. They called him Big Man. His real name was Ralph Albert. And he came out and told me, he said, I went to that pilot and told him to pick you up 2 weeks after he dropped you off, because it was my trap line and my family had been out there trapping and starved out because the country's all burned over. So, but we had a dog team and we could make it back okay. So I told him to go up and pick you up. Then 40 days after you were out there, I went and told him to go pick the body up. The guy that had told me about him telling the pilot to go back and get me, the dog that had saved me was getting kind of old, and he told me, he says, Scotty, he says, when you leave here, let me keep your dog. He said, I'll take good care of him, I'll keep him in the cabin, inside the cabin, and treat him good for the rest of his life. And so, which I did, because I'm a construction worker and I fly all over the state to work construction. So when I flew into Fairbanks that spring, I gave him the dog. And I was working for Jim Company at the time, so they had a job down in Big Delta. And I drove to Big Delta, which is about 100 miles away from Fairbanks. And I was working down there in on a job that you put riprap in the river, and I was a grade foreman on it. While I was down there, this pilot came to my wife at the time and collected the money for the flight to go get me. And she paid him. To this day, I've been in court a few times, but it's been over things that, you know, I didn't cause. And I just still don't believe in lawsuits. I see so many lawsuits nowadays that they're frivolous. They don't make any sense. And people making big bucks off them, I can't see where it helps anybody, including the person that got all the money. Everybody wants something for nothing. And I think, as Paul says, you need to work to eat. You need to do the proper thing to be able to live. And God has been good to me. He's given me my life when, you know, I shouldn't be here today if it wasn't for God. And I really believe that with my prayers, and I know my mother finally died last year, but with a mother's prayer, she was always praying for us kids. And I think God looks after people that are having problems as long as you trust Him. And I think we need to trust God more in everything we do. A few years back, I flew into Fairbanks for a funeral, and he was at the funeral. I don't hold a grudge against anybody, and it made me feel good. I went up and shook his hand because it was only a year or so later that he died in a car accident. And it made me feel good that I had peace. I was at peace with him for what he'd done. And I just feel like, you know, it probably would do me more harm to hold a grudge against anybody than it would, you know, it just, I think that's what hurts people a lot nowadays, is the grudges they hold, because it'll come back to get you. I read the Bible often, and I know what's right and wrong. And I thank God I did. But it did take me years to actually come back. And God was patient with me. It really tells you one thing about our Lord and Savior, that He's a very forgiving God. He waits for you. He's opened the door, and He's waiting for you to come in. The pastor from Nome here, he came back up after I was baptized, and he asked me, "You mean to tell me, I used to walk above your house all the time. You mean to tell me if I'd come down and asked you to church that you would have come?" I told him, yeah, I'd have come. And he couldn't get over that, that he had missed the chance to invite somebody to church that would have come back. If no one has invited you back to church, I myself am inviting you back into the fold, because God is waiting for you. He loves you, and He's patient about, you know, He's a forgiving God. Things we've done in the past, He will forgive them. He's got His arms wide open. So I appeal to you today to give your heart to Christ and come back.
For My Alaska, this has been Ken Crawford. Thanks so much for coming with me.
If you enjoyed watching this series, if you're interested in what you've seen or what we're doing in Alaska,
Go to the Alaska website, alaskaconference.org, and there you'll find additional information.